All right, welcome to another video by Dr. Carroll. I want to start out today by asking who's been on a road trip and has been asked or wanted to ask, are we there yet? Have you been on a road trip and wondered that, or have you been the driver and maybe a niece or a nephew or somebody? So I have more than one kid. And it's only been recently that any of my kids have ever asked that. And part of it is the answer is inherent. If we're driving, we're not there. But what they really want to know is not, are we there yet, but
how much time is it going to take?
Yeah, well, how much is left? My bottom hurts, like I gotta go to the bathroom. I'm done of looking at the road. And so that's for road trips. But what about fast forward from now a couple of years? Your manager, your boss, the CEO is coming to your office. Hey, are we there yet? Probably he or she would ask, are we ready to ship this product? Are we ready to go public? Are we ready to unveil? Are we ready to? And so we're going to talk about some ways and we're going to learn about measuring progress, which is a way to answer that. Say, yeah, we're on track, or we're not, or how are we doing in that regard? And today we're going to focus on 5 in-process metrics. Okay, so metrics that while things are going on, we can look at and understand. So the first one is project milestones. The second one we're going to talk about is code integration. The third one is testing progress. The fourth one is defect discovery and closure. Okay, we've already had an entire lesson about defects, so we're going to come back around on that and build off of that. And the fifth one is process effectiveness. Okay, now feel free to apply this to other areas of your life instead of software development management in terms of how am I progressing towards these goals in life or in general, and see how many of these have takeaways or transferable skills and principles that can go into other areas of your life. Okay, so like I mentioned, we're going to talk about each of these in turn. So let's start with talking about a project milestone. Now, let me start off by saying milestones are not, a milestone is not a metric. Okay, they're different, but we're very, well, hold on. What's a milestone? Let me just make sure we're all on the same page. What's the definition of a milestone?
To get to know where we are and at which point we are in reaching the destination.
So what would be a definition then of a milestone? Because you've got it, but let me just ask in a different way.
It's like a goal set up to reach.
It's like a goal that we have established that says we're hoping to reach we hope to accomplish something, and so that's so you could have a milestone of getting so many credits in graduate school. You could have a milestone of graduation, right? And so that's one. That's how some students measure success. Many of them, and then the next milestone comes right after it. Hopefully, is getting a job. Okay, and so those are hopefully close in time. And then there's other milestones as well. You might have milestones. You want to be a manager one day. You or own your own company, or retire, or. Okay, so great. We have a. Okay, so but those aren't metrics per se. But we're going to kind of force milestones into this whole of metrics, okay? And it fits with everything else, okay? And so the best way to start off heading for success is with a project plan, okay? So a plan to establish what are we going to do, what are we going to work on, how are we going to do it. And in that plan, we're going to lay out our milestones, okay? So we're going to talk a lot about that. And so it covers everything from design specifications to delivery. So everything, okay? Everything from conception to delivery, okay? And so the general rule is to have measurable milestones about every 2 weeks. So about every 2 weeks. And now that's going to differ, depend on multiple things we'll talk about in just a second. But that's the general rule. So this tilde means about. About every 2 weeks. Okay, so then question is what milestones to include? What should we include in our milestones? Well, there's several factors that go into this, okay? Some of them are what is our development methodology? And by that I mean what are we using? What are we using to guide our development model 3 software? Oh no, it's an underscore. Okay. So, have you heard of these before? Waterfall development methodology. Okay, so if we're using a waterfall methodology, we should definitely have several milestones for requirements, several milestones for design, for implementation, several for verification, several for maintenance. Okay, but if we're using a spiral methodology, then our milestones should align with that. Okay, if we have another one. So it depends, first off, what development methodology have we ascribed to? Are we following? And so we need to align our milestones in accordance with that. Okay. Another factor that can influence what milestones to include are project management methodology. Okay, so we talked about development methodology, but now the project management methodology. Okay, so does management prefer daily milestones? Do they want to have everything mapped out to a certain day, or are they okay with and prefer monthly milestones? They feel like, oh, that's so much work to be so granular. Let's just talk about where we should be at the end of this month. And this is known as a work breakdown structure. And so is it every 2 weeks? Is it monthly? Is it daily? Do you have a micromanager? What does that mean? What's a micro? Anybody had a micromanager before? This is recorded, by the way, so careful how you answer. Okay, so so what is a micromanager? In case you hear that term again, or you're accused of it, or you want to accuse somebody of it. So it's someone that is, so micro, meaning very small, and manager is trying to manage every little aspect about it. Your beard on the left needs a little more trimming. It's like, really? Like I'm just making that up. Every single little detail. Instead of like, hey, you're doing a great job, I trust you, and so if there's a micromanager, you're probably going to need smaller milestones because that's what he or she is going to be expecting. Okay, they would feel less comfortable with monthly milestones. Like, how am I going to know, each day that we're on track? A micromanager is not going to be comfortable with that. So part of it is just knowing your manager and their preference. So another factor is the project risk level. Okay. So is this a risky project? Have we taken on something as a team that we've never done before, that we're not quite sure we're going to be able to pull off? So if that's the case, how does that affect our milestones? How should we change milestones if it's a risky project? So if it's risky, we want to we're less comfortable with the development process. We're less sure about our expectations, and so we better have more milestones to give us a better indication if we're on track. So anybody driven a long distance multiple times or taken a long hike? So if you've gone hiking lots of times for like a 20-miler, like 20-kilometer hike or something, and you've done it several times and you're trying to arrive at a certain time, then if you've done it several times before, you'll check every few hours because you're like, oh yeah, I'm always within 15 minutes, I'm good, or but if you're you said, well, I took this. Let me take this other route that has a lot more up down instead of this level. I'm not quite sure how this is going to play out. You're going to want to monitor it more. You're going to want to have more milestones to say, I'm on track, because it's easier to get off track. It's easier to diverge from the expected progress, the needed progress, and so you want more milestones. Okay, so as the risk level goes up, the milestone frequency or granularity should go up. Okay? What about team's experience? And what do I mean by the team's experience? What are some things that are covered in team experience?
Experience they are the work.
How what?
How much the team is experienced to complete the task.
Right, and there's multiple ways that they have experience. One is with the technology they're using. Okay, so if you're doing a mobile device, a mobile app, have they used the tools, or did you just introduce a new tool, or you're trying out a new tool or methodology? Has your team been together, mostly the same people, for 5 or 10 years? Or is it you just hired all these people, they haven't done a single project together, and so they don't have a lot of experience even as a team. Also just not only in the technology, but professionally. Have they been developing professionally for 1 month or 10 years? So 10 years is going to be a lot more predictable than 1 month in many ways. So less experience for the team, how would that affect our milestones?
It will delay it probably. Sometimes there's a chance of delay.
So this is designing, and should we have more milestones or less? That's what I'm trying to ask.
In designing,
Yes, so if we have a less experienced team,
they will have more milestones.
we should have more to verify that, because in some ways it's riskier. There are parallels there.
Mhm.
Great. Okay. Now, early on in the semester, we talked about SMART goals, and we defined milestones. One way to define them is goals. And so it's important to have SMART milestones, okay? So what does SMART stand for again? So the first one is specific, okay? So what we mean by specific is clearly defined. So a milestone, a bad milestone would be produce good software. What does good mean? Like in terms of defects, in terms of customer satisfaction, what does good mean? So we need to clearly define them, and we'll have an exercise to work through these. M is very important. It's measurable. The class name has measurement in it, so you could reasonably understand that is highlighted, okay? And so by measurable, we mean it is clear whether or not the goal was achieved. Okay, it is obvious that we achieved it or not. Okay, or and so there's ways we can measure it. Now, it's not to say you shouldn't have goals that are less measurable, but we're talking about milestones. So you either achieved the milestone or you didn't. And now I just said achievable is the next milestone. So anybody run a marathon? You've run a marathon? Okay. So what do you call it? Now I've got to raise my my example now that you've changed my expectations. What is it when you like run a marathon a day? There's like some name for that. I think it's a compulsive disorder. That was a joke. But there are people that run like a marathon a day, which is just crazy. I mean, like I can't run a marathon. When did you run a marathon? How long ago? A month ago?
No, in my college there was 10 kilometers marathon.
Oh, okay. Let me be a little careful here. In the United States, when we say marathon, we mean 26.2 miles continuously. So 26.2, let's see, a kilometer is 1.6. There's 1.6 kilometers per mile. Is that right? So then we take 26.2 times 1.6, so about 42 kilometers, okay? So when they say marathon in America, they mean 42 kilometers, okay? So there are such things as half marathons, which would then be 21 kilometers. And so that's, if you've seen cars that have little stickers that says 26.2, that's what it means. It means I ran a marathon. Or at least I want you to think I ran a marathon. And if you see 13.1, the implied units is miles. There are others such as 100 I forget. I think that is typically a triathlon, because otherwise that's just crazy. Anyway, so that's what that means. In case you're driving around, it's like, why do people have these numbers? You know, like that's not their age, because like that is so specific. Okay, but the whole point of that was, okay, this weekend we're going to run a marathon, a 42 kilometer marathon. Is that achievable? I think I would not be here on Monday if I attempted a serious attempt to make that, or if I did make it. If I did make it, I wouldn't be here on Monday. Either I cannot run a marathon this weekend. It takes time to train up, to prepare for it. Did you train for your 10 kilometer? So that's small enough. I think you can get away with it, just general healthy habits.
Yeah, I play outdoor sports a lot, so.
But could you do 40 kilometers in a day?
No, maximum is 15 or 20.
Okay, so right now a 42 kilometer marathon is not achievable right now. And so now if we said 6 weeks from now, and we had a professional trainer that said, I've done this before, you can do it. Well, if you're dedicated, yes, I could see that. I'm just estimating here. And by the way, that's not a class requirement. Okay, so achievable. Okay, and now relevant. Okay, we've just been talking about marathons. Is that relevant for software development? No. So like, if you saw like run a marathon and designs, your milestones, it's like that is so irrelevant. And so does it help us make progress? Does it directly affect project progress? Okay, is it a good indication of project progress? Okay, so that's how we can define relevancy. And then the T is time-based. Okay, is it time-bound, time-based? Okay. All right, I think it's time for some exercises. We're talking about measuring progress, and we want exercises. Okay. Okay, so let's apply this SMART framework, and I've repeated it here for you so that in case you didn't memorize it, although it'd be good to memorize. Cough, cough. Let's assume here we're in the requirements phase milestones, so that's assuming we're talking about like a waterfall methodology. So we're in requirements here, and so there's these, in that phase we have these milestones, and let's evaluate each one of them as a SMART milestone, where SMART is here. So let's talk about each one of these, okay? So let's read over them collectively, and then let's evaluate each one of them on each of the 5 SMART attributes. So draft requirements, internal requirement review for development or staffing or testing staff, requirements updated and delivered to customer for concurrence, and customer concurrence obtained, requirements plan format approved, final requirements published and put under formal change control. Okay, so let's talk about these. So this first one, draft requirements. Is it SMART? Is it specific? Okay, so and part of this depends on, do we know what we mean by that in our team? So that, and this is the verb tense here, I think is a little misleading, and no, never mind. So that would say that we have the requirements drafted up. Okay, draft is a little dangerous of a word because it suggests, this is a draft 1, draft 2. So we could say first draft if that's what we meant. How formal are we trying to be? Is it measurable? Oh, back to specific. Who's going to do that? So we're going to produce this would assume we've already met with the client. We had a nice talk, we had examples, and then we're saying, okay, now we're going to draft up requirements. Okay, so sorry, a little background there. So we've met with the client, we have an understanding of the project, and now it's a draft requirements. But who's going to do it? I need a name, a fictitious name.
Isn't it going to be the client because he has to give the requirements about how should we develop the project?
Great. That is a very important step with requirements, because your ultimate goal is to produce this for a client. So then if we come down here, what we want to do is in our team, in our software development team, we want to work through the requirements, think about them, say, wait a second, you can't have this and this. Those are mutually exclusive. Work through them, think about it, talk about how much effort it's going to take, and then notice we have down here, deliver to the customer, the client. So we do need that feedback with our clients to say, hey, this is what I think you're asking for, or this is what we can do, so that everything is on board. And then the client can say, no, that's not going to meet my needs, or that's not what I want. And so there can be some feedback there with that. But this is internal initially. So draft requirements, we could say Michael needs to do that. if you put an owner to it, then it helps it clearly define who is responsible for it, instead of just leaving it up in the air for, well, did you do it? Well, I thought that was your job. You did the last one. Well, I did the last one for you because you had it. And so then now it's very clear. Michael is going to do it or make sure it is done. And so now we have a responsibility and ownership placed on Michael, whoever that is. Okay? If you have more than one Michael, make sure you specify the last name. And maybe a middle initial or something along those lines. Okay? Can we... and so there could be some protocol in your company where it needs to be deposited in the company Dropbox, or it needs to be printed and put in everybody's boxes, or it needs to some way that, yes, it was delivered. We know that it is done, okay? Or even just it's like here at CSU, it'd be posted to Google Docs and there's a timestamp on it, and we know that the last edit was made on this date. It's fairly clear when it was completed, okay? So can we know that the milestone was met, is measurable for draft requirements? Yeah. Is it achievable? We had better be able to draft requirements, assuming we have met with them. So maybe what would be more helpful is, let's go through each of these and apply it as a whole. I was going to go through the requirements, but let's change that to going through specific. How can we make these more specific? So we said add an owner to draft requirements, and really that would apply to each one of these, right? And I'm not going to come up with names, but you could say, okay, hey, Mary's in charge of this one, Tim is in charge of this one, Susan's in charge of this one, Bob's, Michael again, or whatever, okay? So what about measurable? Can we make any of these more measurable? What about achievable? Well, that's kind of hard to answer with a fictitious team, right? What about relevant? Are any of these not relevant? Do we really need to monitor whether the format of our plan is approved? So to me that seems like, well, that's not really going to help us know that we're on track, in terms of like what paper to use, like what font. So I would submit that's not relevant. I mean, maybe we feel like we need to do it, but doesn't need to be a major milestone. And then what about this last one, time-based? Are these time-based? There's no indication of time here, is there? So how could we improve that then? So there's two ways we could do it. We could either say, hey, this is going to take 2 weeks to be able to accomplish this, or we could say, hey, this needs to happen by April 30th. Right? There's two ways to do it. This is good because then you don't have compounded error. We slipped a little bit, slipped a little bit, slipped a little bit. We have probably would want to be able to talk about a ship date and not a a duration until ship date. So, I mean, if we told a client we expect to ship this in 40 weeks, they're going to look up a calendar, look at 40 weeks, and say, okay, this date. And so they're going to translate that, even if we told them a duration, to a date. And then it puts it a little firmer in the ground. Instead of 2 weeks is more loose. And then we would do that for all of these. That's important to have it be for all of these, so that we can know if we're making grounds or not. For our milestones that have longer time frames, we should make smaller milestones to make sure we're keeping progress. Okay. There are several project planning tools. Maybe you've even used one of these before. For example, let's see. You could, anybody made a Gantt chart before? Okay, so here's an example, simple Gantt chart that you could make in Excel. This is actually a template that I downloaded. But this to illustrate, this is not a complex graph, but what it does is it shows you different tasks, and you can give these, descriptive labels, and based over time, and then you can see progression, and then you can see how they interact one with another. Now, you could have a more sophisticated chart, for example, something like this, where you could show percent complete, and we'll talk about that. Again, notice it's time and it's activities and showing progress. Technically speaking, if you're showing dependencies like this, then it's actually a PERT. A PERT example is what I'm looking for. So it looks something more like this. This is a display from Microsoft Project. Okay, so you can see here in this example, the red is the bottleneck line of processes. You can see, okay, this process is dependent on this one. Again, notice that it's time. It's a graphical visualization of a task over time. This shows the dependencies. Okay, we need to finish this one before this one. You can see where different ones overlap. And this also indicates like which ones can have some fudge room or not. And so these are different project planning tools to be able to track our progress. Some managers are going to love graphs and charts and visualizations. Others just would rather have an email saying, hey, we're on track. And so you'll see some managers making all sorts of Gantt and PERT charts and whatnot, and others that are just going to keep it in a flat text file or keep it on a post-it note type of a approach. Okay, so it kind of depends on the style. We can use milestones as gates. And so gates usually are correlated with some key conclusion. Okay, so this could be a milestone to complete this one, or all of these could be this could represent, this is the milestone. These gates also reflect transition times. Okay, we have concluded that phase. We are now transitioning into this phase. It also gives us a good opportunity to understand, are we on track? Do we need some intervention to be able to get on track? Okay. All right, that's what I want to say about project milestones. Now let's talk about code integration. Okay, so this is the phase with coding, unit testing, and integration into system libraries. Okay, it's more of a process than an event, typically, of working to achieve this. So have you ever been asked or asked, how's a software project coming? You know, how far are you? How percent complete are you? So who's working on a project right now for another class or a side job, or anybody have a project they're currently working on? No? Well, we can fix that. Okay, but if you were, and I said, well, how's it coming? And I said, well, I'm about 80% done. What does that mean for a software development project? Think about your own projects. At what point were you 80% done? Or you felt like you're 80% done?
We are almost reaching the requirements, but then we have to check for errors, like testing.
We're done with the coding and all.
Yeah.
Okay, so how long are you 80% done for? Or 90% done? Have you ever been 90% done with a project for a long time?
Yeah.
So were you really 90% done?
It's like,
How do you know until you're 100%? It's only in hindsight that you can say, oh, I was 85% done. Well, we're measuring progress we're talking about in-process metrics.
mm-hmm.
We don't want to wait till we've shipped it to then talk about what was our progress and how do we do. Now, that is useful to have historical data. But generally, less mature teams are going to use percent complete for a project, because that is hard to wrap our heads on. It makes it hard to measure, because if you're a project manager and you ask a developer, how's it going? I'm 90% done. Next week you ask them, how is it going? I'm 90% done. What does that mean? Are they closer to being done, or were they on vacation all week? It's like, it's hard to know when they're 90% done for a long time. So then what can we measure? We've talked about this before, so what can we measure in terms of software development? I think we've mentioned it every lecture, except maybe last one. Lines of code. We can measure lines of code, right? It's a simple thing that keeps recurring. We can measure lines of code, or kilolines of code, okay? And so what we can do is we can track the kilolines of code per week, okay? And we can look at that and know how are we doing in terms of is it integrated. We can look at the integrated lines of code per week, and then we can look at the cumulative, and then we should be able to compare that against patterns from historical data to say, okay, are we on track for what we estimated? You know, here's our typical pattern for this kind of project. Is this project on track? And we can compare that, okay? So for code integration then, we should establish a code integration metric and a target code integration pattern and be able to measure against that, okay? Now let's talk about testing progress, okay? So we've talked about planning, we've talked about the coding, unit testing, integration. Now let's talk more about the formal testing progress. So this is the easiest stage to measure, okay? Easiest stage to measure. Why would that be? Why would it be the easiest stage to measure? Because what we can do is we can count tests. And we've hopefully already specified these are the tests we are going to run. And so then we can count how many of the tests have we executed, okay? And then maybe more importantly is how many have completed successfully. And so that's easy to count, and we can compare it against an upper and lower bounds from previous performance to say, okay, we should be somewhere between here at week 5 for in our testing phase for tests that have that we have passed, that we have successfully passed. Okay? And so for our testing progress, we need to establish testing metrics and objectives and then use those for measurement. Okay, we've talked a lot in the past about defect discovery. What's a defect again? Just make sure, page that information in. Is there a word that, a term that is more familiar than defect for you? A what? A fault? Or an error, a bug? Okay, so some of these words are used interchangeably, so if I say defect, you could probably replace it with a bug or a fault. So this is hopefully before we ship, so it's not a failure, it's a fault. Okay, do you remember in the previous presentation that we had, what was one of the major benefits of defects? We talked about, while defects are typically negative in nature, right? You want as little of them as possible. From a management and estimation measurement standpoint, they can be very helpful. Why is that? Because they follow distinct patterns, and because of that, they are very predictive and indicative of progress. So while defects, bugs, are negative in nature, we can learn a lot from how many bugs did we discover this week? How many have we discovered? Where are we on our backlog of bugs? Backlog meaning bugs that we haven't squashed is the slang term, but that we haven't fixed, we haven't resolved, we haven't closed. Okay? And so it's a great way to measure progress, both the quality and how are we doing on schedule. Okay? And remember that they follow Rayleigh curves. Okay? And so let's see. Let me just pull up a Rayleigh curve to jog your memory. So, so here are several Rayleigh curves with different parameters. And so as you notice, they typically have a peak, they have a ramp up, a peak, and then a tail. Okay? And so depending on the parameters we give it, but they're distinctive for this peak. And so in software development, we usually see them more like this rather than just a mound here. Okay? And so we can look at that peak, we can look at that distribution to understand more of what's going on. So if, furthermore, let me remind you, we saw this before, that defects over time, okay, that the black is what we are seeing as time progresses, and the blue is either a lower limit or an upper limit from what we would expect from historical and projections. Okay, so in measuring progress, we can compare it against a Rayleigh curve. Okay, so what if this peak here that we're talking about, what if it's earlier or later? What does that mean? Well, so if this peak shows up earlier with this project than what we were thinking, what does that mean? It means we're finding more bugs, but is that good or is it bad? Well, it depends, and it's kind of a loaded question. So let's look at kill lines of code. So, all right. So we could, and as I mentioned before, we could have tracked how many lines of code that are in integration per week, right? This is not the cumulative. We could sum all these up to get the cumulative, which would tell us how many lines of code do we have? And then we could look at our kill lines of code and our defects per week then, and say, well, how are we doing? So again, the blue is kill lines of code on the y-axis. Our x-axis again is what week are we in. But then this is defect discovery. And so as we have more code in integration, we're going to expect somewhat of a Rayleigh curve here for the number of defects, okay? Now, if we have several historical projects, we could use standard deviation to put those limits on. Defect. So then we could look at a defect status chart, okay, and say, okay, how are we doing? Okay, here the x-axis is week again, and the y-axis is defects. And the blue now is a line. It's really a histogram, but 3 histograms are kind of hard to visualize at once, so I made it a line. So discovered defects. Okay, so this means in week 9 we discovered 42 defects. Okay, in week 10 we discovered less. Okay, so that's following a Rayleigh curve more or less. Okay, and now we can also track how many bugs did we squash, how many closed defects did we have each week. And with those two measurements, we can then track how many open defects there are. This is our backlog, okay, is another way we look at it. Okay, and so are we squashing the bugs at a good rate? We can expect there's a little bit of delay from when they're discovered to when they're squashed, right? But we should also, so then this comes back to that first question, or the early question of when should we ship, right? If we covered up this, should we ship at week 14, week 15? Now this is in hindsight, so it makes the question a lot easier. So let's say we're at week 16. We didn't find any bugs. Should we ship? So some general rules for when should you ship is, has the stream of bugs discovered gone down? We see a ramp down of bugs discovered. That's a good sign. It's suggesting we're getting most of them, that we are finding less. So we want to see that, so that this is one strong indication that we're getting ready to ship. Another one is, okay, well this is just a count of bugs. Are they severe bugs or are they minor bugs? And so another indication of we're ready to ship is there are no severe bugs. There are no big showstoppers there. Now, the other question is, well, what is the quality threshold of the project? Is this our first project for a major client? We want the utmost quality. Have we shipped lots of projects before and there's kind of an expectation of quality? And so if we are within that same realm, what's our level of reliability? Is this life support systems? Is this something that's needed to get something to Mars? You know, those are different. Then we need less bugs under those circumstances. Please, if you're making my future pacemaker, please don't have bugs in it when you deploy it, okay? I would appreciate that. Thank you. I hope to not need one for a while. So you have some time. Okay, so now this is just one project, and certainly we could compile this for multiple projects. And so what if, and we can look at estimates, we can say, imagine we covered up the data from weeks 12 to 16 here, okay? Let's imagine. Then, so week 12, cut that off. So we could look at the trends and we could extrapolate okay, well, we've seen this looks like it's following a Rayleigh curve. We've seen this. We anticipate that it's going to go down. Okay, and so we could estimate a ship date, because if your boss came by a month ago and said, "Hey, are we on track to ship?" You'd say, I was just reviewing the numbers. I'm noticing that the bugs discovered is starting to drop off significantly. That's what we'd expect for right now. We're still squashing lots of them, so that's good. Our backlog is dropping off significantly. That's good. But if the projections aren't, then we have a couple options. What would be our options if our projections are not suggesting we're going to match our ship date? What can you do as a manager? You could argue for we need more staff, or if you have the power, you could assign more staff to squashing bugs or finding them if you think that's a problem. You could change the ship date. Now, more time. That might not be an option, right? Your CEO might say, no way. Or they might say, hey, quality is more important than delivery date, so we'll let that slip. I'll let the client know. And it depends on the situation. Or we do have another option, and it depends, is we could release a lower quality product. And so if that's acceptable, if that's in the business needs, then those are our options, and we need to weigh those and say, well, which are we going to do? If we have to ship something, then and I can't get any more staff, then that leaves us with the only alternative of ship a lower quality product. So I got a question for you. This is more modern, a trend is, so anybody use software that's online only? You don't even download it, you use it in a browser. How would that change a ship date? What is a ship date for a software that's online only?
Launching it online.
Making it available. Now, how does that change failures? What's the definition of a failure? A failure is a defect, bug, fault found after deployment. So let me back up. Have you ever received software in the mail? Okay, I'm getting some blank stares here. Okay, so back in the day when software was new, we used to use a telephone, or we used to, before telephones, we'd write a letter, and weeks later we'd get a diskette in the mail, and then you could load the software. So if you think about that paradigm and understand some of these methodologies and paradigms were put in place when that was reality, how does that change your view of failures? So if you have a failure in code that you had to mail out, and now you need to do a release again, that's a lot of money to do all the mailings, apologize to your customers, they need to reload it. So what changes have we seen, and how does that affect how we view failures and product deployment? Anybody have any software that updates automatically? You have lots of software that does it. Your browser says, hey, there's an update available. It will be effective or active as soon as you close your browser and reopen it. It's automatically pulling updates. It used to be you had to get it in the mail, plug it in, close it, reinstall it, and pull it back up. That's a lot more cumbersome than just, oh, we found a bug, let's get it out. So I think what it has done is it has lowered the threshold for deployment in terms of quality, because we can quickly recover from, hey, there was a known problem over in India. We haven't been seeing it in the US, but that code's the same, so let's just update our versions for both, and then we can do that. And if it's online only, you don't even have to have the user, the user can turn off updates if it's on their computer potentially, but if it's an online company, my I have a family member that works for lucidchart.com. A lot of their products, well, some of their products it's a website. And so you found a bug in their display tool, well, change it, hit a couple things, and then it's ready to go. Now, they have tons of users, so you should probably plan when you do that, unless it's a severe bug and you just need to deploy it immediately. Anyway, but I thought that was interesting. That's a modern issue that really wasn't around when this textbook was written, to have instant updates. And so that's different. When do you ship it? And so it also depends on your product. So in summary, for defect discovery and closure, we should define expected defect discovery and closure patterns, and then we can monitor them. Okay, so while defects are negative in nature, they're very positive in terms of quality and schedule process. Okay, let's talk about the last one now. Process effectiveness. So what we want to do is we want to think about, okay, this process, and this is very good for when corrective action is needed. So an example for process effectiveness might be the inspection hours, okay, and we could divide by the inspection object size. Okay, now those are weird terms, or terms we haven't really been using before. So one way to use them is we could say it's our staff hours. How many hours are we clocking in the numerator? And in the denominator, it could be our traditional kilolines of code or function points or something like that. And so we can look at this, and this is really a intensity of it, and we could couple this, say, with defect discovery. So let's run through four scenarios. Four scenarios here. So first scenario is that our defect discovery rates are lower than expected. Okay, our peak is not quite as high. We're not getting quite as much. Now, we've talked about what does that mean, but let's say we have that and we see that our inspection in effectiveness is on track. Okay, now we have this second guide. So if our defect discovery rates are lower than expected, but we're producing code at about the rate we're hoping to, that would suggest then that maybe the project, maybe we could be a little optimistic that things are on track and they're looking a little better than they have before. Okay, now that we have this second metric, before I had to say, well, it kind of depends. Now, if you include inspection effectiveness, we can say, okay, well, this is good, or this could be good. Okay, so I said there's four scenarios. What if the defect discovery rates are lower than expected, but our inspection effectiveness is below our objective? So this would say, well, maybe some of the bugs, some of the defects are slipping through. Let's look at the other possibilities here. Okay, so if we're finding bugs at a higher rate, and our inspection effectiveness is above our objective, what do you think that would indicate? We're finding more bugs, but we're also making better progress. This would suggest maybe we're doing better than we have before. It would still, let's keep an eye on this because we're seeing more bugs and that concerns us, but the inspection effectiveness suggests, hey, maybe we're doing great. And now there's a fourth scenario here. Defect discovery rates are higher than expected, and now this is below our objective. What does that mean? That's where you should see red flags going off, sirens and alerts like, this is not good. We're seeing more bugs than we anticipated, and we're not being as effective. This is concern for alarm that we are probably behind, significantly behind where we want to be. Okay? So in summary, we should estimate the process effectiveness, measures, and objectives for all major phases of the life cycle. That concludes what I have for today, unless there are any questions. Okay.